Today we're going to wrap up the chapter in social studies with just a little bit of a review about what you've been reading. So let me share my screen with you and we'll get started. The chapter was all about working and trading during the colonial times, which was all in the early 1700s. You learned the word apprentice. An apprentice is somebody who learns a trade from a skilled worker. Well, to be an apprentice, most of the time they were boys. They had to work very long hours. They had hardly any time off. And it was hard. They didn't get paid much money. And really, the only good thing that came about that, being an apprentice, was that you had a good chance to get a good job in the future. Most of the time, you would leave home when you were your age, or maybe a little bit older, and you would stay with that person that was training you for years until you were good enough to go off and start on your own. Girls, they didn't get to be apprentices very often. Most of the time, they stayed home and they learned how to cook and they learned how to sew and take care of the family. If you were a farm kid, well, most farm kids grew up to be farmers, and they worked hard every day on the farm, early hours from sunup to sundown. You also learned about candle making. They didn't have electricity back then, and they needed candles to light up their homes in the evening. They made them from animal fat, and when they burned them, they smelled terribly until they learned how to make candles from using more fragrant smelling berries. And that changed everything to have a better smelling candle in your house. You also learned the word artisan. Artisan. You can see the word art right in there. An artisan is a worker who makes things out of their hands. A blacksmith was very good at making things out of metal, anything from silverware to horseshoes. Seamstress is somebody who also made clothes by hand. We also reviewed a little bit about the different regions of the colonies. So let's take a review about what was happening in each one. In the Northeast, they had a lot of trees as natural resources. And from those trees, many people became boat makers. They also made houses and they sold the wood to the other colonies. They also were interested in fishing, lots of good fishing area, lobster fishing. And because there was so much wood, they made barrels. A barrel maker, if you remember from the list, was called a cooper. In the middle colonies, they had a really good fertile soil for farming. And because they grew so much wheat and they turned that wheat into bread, they were known as the breadbasket of the colonies. They sold their food to the southern colonies and the New England colonies. They also were able to dig a lot of iron up out of the ground to use, and they had many mills to make flour. In the South, they had very large farms owned by just one or two people that owned a lot of these plantations. And the plantations then, they were so big that the owners, the proprietors, needed to find people to work on them. And that's where slavery began. These plantations grew a lot of cash crops, including tobacco and rice, and something called indigo. Indigo was a plant that they used the dye from it to color clothes so that the clothes were much more colorful to wear. You also read about something called the triangular trade route. The triangular trade route was called that, as you can see, because it was shaped as a triangle. If it started out in the colonies over here, they would bring their supplies such as sugar and tobacco and cotton, and they would bring it over to here into Europe. In Europe, then they would trade those goods and get things like cloth or textiles to make rugs and they would get alcohol and any other manufactured goods that they had in Europe that weren't available in the colonies, and they would head down next to Africa. And it was along the coast here of Africa that these uh, boats, captains of the boats, I guess, would grab slaves and they would bring them to the colonies and they would use them to work on the plantations. That was a pretty awful time. They would go into the villages and they would um, steal people right out of their homes in their towns. They would look for strong men and young boys that they could bring with them over so that they could get good money from the plantation owners. Along the way, on those ships, they treated the slaves terribly. The slaves, most of the time, were all down in the basement part of the boat. They were packed in very tightly, given very little water, very little food to eat. Many of them got sick with diseases that the white men had, that were the sailors, that they were never exposed to before. Many of them suffered and died. And you can see from the picture, they would just toss the bodies overboard. And the reason why they were bringing the Africans here is because they were being brought to the colonies to work on the southern plantations. And that about wraps up our chapter on work and trade.